The Galactic Defense Academy had seen its share of unlikely candidates over the centuries, but Lucia was something special. And by special, we mean she could probably use the Academy's trophy case as a stepladder without much difficulty. At barely 5 feet tall, and that was being generous with her boots on, she stood among her fellow cadets like a particularly determined garden gnome that had wandered into a basketball convention. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the Academy's recruitment board, who had apparently decided that what the galaxy's premier military institution really needed was someone who could literally walk under most alien species without ducking. "Formation, cadets!" Instructor Blackstone's voice cut across the training yard like a plasma blade through butter. The man had the kind of presence that made grown Corthans weep and lesser mortals reconsider their career choices. Standing at an imposing 6'8", with shoulders that could double as landing platforms for small shuttlecraft, he surveyed his charges with the enthusiasm of someone examining week-old ration packs. The cadets scrambled into position. There was Uma, Lucia's bunkmate, all long limbs and athletic grace, moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd been born to wear a uniform. Beside her stood Kultex, whose crystalline exoskeleton caught the artificial sunlight and threw it back in prismatic rainbows. Beautiful if you could ignore the fact that he had mandibles capable of crushing durasteel and compound eyes that tracked movement like targeting computers. Then there was Holbrook, 6'6" of pure human arrogance, with the kind of square jaw that belonged on recruitment posters and the kind of attitude that belonged in a recycling chute. He'd made it his personal mission to remind everyone, but especially Lucia, that physical prowess was what separated the wheat from the chaff in military service. "Today, we're running combat scenarios," Blackstone announced, his voice carrying the weight of impending doom. Full gear, live ammunition simulations, and terrain obstacles designed by someone with a particularly sadistic sense of humor. His eyes swept over the assembled cadets and lingered, just for a moment, on Lucia. "I trust everyone remembers that, in the field, there are no participation trophies, only survivors and cautionary tales." Lucia felt the familiar weight of expectation, or rather, the complete lack thereof. She'd grown accustomed to the looks, the barely concealed smirks, the way conversations seemed to redirect themselves around her like she was some sort of conversational black hole. It wasn't personal, really. It was just physics. In a galaxy where the average sentient being stood somewhere between 6 and 9 feet tall, she was what you might charitably call vertically economical. "Caney!" Blackstone's bark snapped her attention back to the present. "You'll be taking point on the tactical assessment." The faux announcement landed like a meteorite in a meditation garden. Holbrook's face cycled through several expressions, settling on something between disbelief and constipation. Uma shot her a look that was part encouragement, part concern, and entirely confused. Even Kultex's antennae twitched in what she'd learned to recognize as his species' equivalent of raised eyebrows. "Sir?" Lucia's voice came out steadier than she felt, which was something of a minor miracle. "You heard me, Cadet. Your tactical scores are—" Blackstone paused, consulting his datapad with the expression of a man who'd just discovered his coffee had been replaced with engine coolant. "Exceptional. Your physical performance ratings, however, suggest you might lose an arm wrestling match to a particularly determined houseplant." A few snickers rippled through the ranks. Lucia felt her cheeks warm but kept her expression neutral. This was nothing new. Her tactical simulations consistently scored in the 98th percentile. Her obstacle course times, on the other hand, would have been impressive if the Academy had been selecting cadets for competitive napping. "The point," Blackstone continued, his voice cutting through the ambient chuckles like a vibroblade through silk, is that military leadership isn't always about who can bench press a hover tank. Sometimes it's about who can think 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still figuring out which end of their weapon goes bang. The training ground fell silent. In the distance, the Academy's massive communications array rotated slowly against the alien sky, its sensors constantly sweeping for threats that, thankfully, existed mostly in the realm of theoretical possibility. The Galactic Council had enjoyed nearly 2 centuries of relative peace, broken only by the occasional trade dispute or diplomatic tantrum. "You have 6 hours to complete the scenario," Blackstone said, his tone suggesting he expected at least half of them to require medical attention by the end. "Objectives will be transmitted to your tactical displays. Rules of engagement are simple. Accomplish the mission, keep your team alive, and try not to embarrass the uniform. Questions?" Holbrook's hand shot up like he was volunteering to test experimental explosives. "Sir, with respect, shouldn't point position go to someone with appropriate physical qualifications?" The silence that followed was the kind that made small animals seek shelter and made smart people reconsider their life choices. Blackstone's stare could have stripped paint at 50 meters. "Are you questioning my judgment, Cadet Holbrook?" "No, sir, but—" "Then I suggest you focus on following orders rather than giving them. You'll have plenty of opportunities to demonstrate your appropriate qualifications during the exercise." Holbrook's jaw worked silently for a moment before settling into a tight line. "Yes, sir." "Outstanding! Move out." The cadets dispersed toward the equipment, lockers, the conversation buzzing with speculation and barely concealed excitement. Uma fell into step beside Lucia, her expression thoughtful. "You know he's setting you up, right?" Uma said quietly. "This is either going to be your moment of triumph or your very public humiliation." Lucia adjusted her gear harness, which had been designed for someone considerably larger and required creative engineering to achieve anything resembling a proper fit. "Probably both, knowing my luck." "The thing is," Uma continued, slinging her plasma rifle with practiced ease, "I've watched you in the tactical sims. You see patterns that the rest of us miss. You think in ways that make my brain hurt just trying to follow along. Thanks, I think. My point is, maybe Blackstone isn't setting you up for failure. Maybe he's setting everyone else up to learn something." Before Lucia could respond, Kultex appeared beside them with the unsettling silence that was characteristic of his species. His mandibles clicked in what she'd learned was his version of thoughtful consideration. "The instructor is correct about tactical thinking," he said, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made all insectoid languages sound like they were being sung by a choir of wind chimes. "In my culture, the greatest warriors are often the smallest. We learn to think beyond physical limitations because we must." "Easy for you to say," Holbrook interjected, appearing with the timing of someone who'd been eavesdropping. "Your people have natural armor and enough poison to drop a charging Rhinox. Some of us have to rely on actual combat skills." "Actual combat skills," Kultex repeated, his antennae tilting in a gesture that somehow managed to convey profound skepticism. "Like running in straight lines and shooting at targets that don't shoot back?" "Like being able to carry wounded teammates to safety," Holbrook shot back. "Like being able to hold a position against superior numbers. Like being able to do more than hide behind cover and hope someone else handles the heavy lifting." The conversation was heading toward the kind of territory that usually resulted in disciplinary action and medical attention. Lucia stepped forward. Not because she particularly wanted to be in the middle of this, but because someone had to be the adult in the room. "How about we save the measuring contest for after we complete the mission?" she suggested. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to explain to Blackstone why we failed, because we were too busy arguing about who's tougher." Holbrook's expression suggested he was considering several responses, none of which would have improved the situation. After a moment that felt like it lasted approximately one geological age, he turned and stalked toward the mission briefing area. "That went well," Uma observed. "About as well as a reactor breach in a daycare center," Lucia agreed. The mission briefing turned out to be refreshingly straightforward, which in military terms meant it was probably going to be anything but. A simulated enemy force had established a forward operating base in the Academy's training sector. The cadets were to infiltrate, gather intelligence, and neutralize the threat with minimal casualties. Standard stuff, really. The kind of scenario they'd run dozens of times in various configurations. The twist, as there always was a twist, was that the enemy force was being played by senior cadets from the Advanced Warfare program. Real opponents with real training and a real desire to demonstrate their superiority over the underclassmen. "Wonderful," Uma muttered, studying the tactical display. "So we're not just playing war games. We're playing war games against people who actually know what they're doing." Lucia examined the terrain map with the intensity of someone trying to find a winning lottery ticket in a pile of grocery receipts. The training sector was a maze of artificial canyons, mock buildings, and terrain features designed to simulate every hostile environment the galaxy had to offer. It was, in the words of previous cadet classes, a special kind of educational nightmare. "There," she said finally, pointing to a seemingly unremarkable section of the map. "That's where they'll set up their command post." Holbrook looked where she was pointing and frowned. "That's not defensible. It's in a valley with multiple approach routes and no natural barriers." "Exactly," Lucia said, "which is why it's perfect. They know we'll avoid it because it looks like a trap. So they'll use it because they know we won't expect them to use something that obvious." "That's—" Uma paused, working through the logic. "Actually, kind of brilliant." "Or completely wrong," Holbrook added helpfully. "Only one way to find out," Lucia said, shouldering her equipment pack and trying not to think about the fact that it weighed approximately as much as she did. "Let's go make some educational mistakes." The exercise began at dawn, which in the Academy's artificial environment meant the environmental systems gradually brightened the overhead illumination while playing a recording of alien bird calls that sounded like a combination of pleasant chirping and mild indigestion. The cadets moved out in standard formation, with Lucia in the lead and trying very hard to look like she knew what she was doing. The first hour passed without incident, unless you counted Holbrook's increasingly obvious efforts to position himself where he could take over if things went sideways, which they inevitably would, because that was the nature of military exercises and the universe in general. "Contact," Coltex reported from his position on the team's flank. 3 hostiles, approximately 200 meters northeast. Lucia dropped to one knee and activated her tactical display, studying the terrain and the positions of both her team and the detected enemies. Standard doctrine would call for a flanking maneuver using the Ebheider natural cover to approach from an unexpected angle, which was exactly what the opposition would be expecting. "Change of plans," she announced quietly. "We're going straight at them." The silence that followed was broken only by the ambient sound of alien bird calls and Uma's carefully controlled breathing. "Come again?" Holbrook's voice carried the kind of disbelief usually reserved for particularly improbable ghost stories. Straight at them, Lucia repeated. Down the main approach, in full view, making enough noise to wake the dead. That's suicide, Holbrook protested. No, Lucia said, studying her tactical display with the focused intensity of someone solving a particularly complex puzzle. That's psychology. They're positioned for an ambush. They're expecting us to be clever, to use cover and concealment, to approach from an unexpected direction. They're not expecting us to walk straight into what looks like certain death. Because it is certain death, Uma pointed out, with the patience of someone explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. Only if they're actually trying to kill us, Lucia said. But they're not. They're trying to win a training exercise. There's a difference. She pointed to her display, highlighting the enemy positions. Look at their placement. It's textbook perfect for an ambush, but it's also textbook perfect for containing and capturing an enemy force without causing casualties. They're positioned to surround us, not eliminate us. So, Holbrook demanded, so we don't let them surround us. We hit them head-on, fast and loud, before they can react to something they're not expecting. By the time they realize we're not following the script, we'll already be past their position and moving on the real objective. It was, she had to admit, either tactically brilliant or spectacularly stupid, possibly both. But it was also exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that had earned her those high tactical scores, and exactly the kind of plan that would either validate Blackstone's decision to put her in charge or provide him with an object lesson in the dangers of promoting cadets based on test scores alone. All right, Uma said finally. I'm in, but if this gets us all shot, I'm going to be very upset with you. Fair enough, Lucia agreed. They advanced down the main approach route with all the stealth of a parade and approximately the same level of subtlety. Lucia could practically feel the enemy positions tracking their movement, could imagine the confusion as their opponents tried to figure out what kind of tactical doctrine called for walking directly into an obvious kill zone. The answer, of course, was the kind of tactical doctrine that relied on doing the one thing your enemy wasn't prepared for. The blindingly obvious. They were 50 meters from the first enemy position when the shooting started. Simulated plasma bolts filled the air around them, close enough to feel the heat, but carefully, aimed to avoid actual contact. Training exercise or not, getting hit by a simulation round was still an experience best avoided. "Move! Move! Move!" Lucia shouted, leading the charge straight into the heart of the ambush. The enemy cadets, caught completely off guard by an approach that violated every principle of sound tactical thinking, hesitated for the crucial few seconds it took for Lucia's team to blow past their positions and continue toward the primary objective. "Well," Uma panted as they reached cover on the far side of the ambush site, "that was either the stupidest thing I've ever done or the most brilliant." "Probably both," Lucia agreed, checking her tactical display, and noting with satisfaction that they were now behind the enemy's prepared positions and approaching the main objective from an entirely unexpected direction. Behind them, she could hear the sound of confused voices and the kind of creative profanity that usually accompanied the realization that a carefully planned operation had just been completely derailed by someone who apparently didn't understand basic tactical principles. "You know," Coltex observed, his mandibles clicking in what she'd learned was his version of amusement, "I'm beginning to think Blackstone knew exactly what he was doing when he put you in charge." "Let's see if you still think that when this is over," Lucia replied. But deep down, she was starting to think he might be right. The Academy's communications array continued its slow rotation overhead. its sensors sweeping the void between stars for threats that existed mostly in the realm of theoretical possibility. It was a routine that had continued unchanged for decades, a constant reminder that the galaxy was vast and largely peaceful, which was why the first detection alerts went largely unnoticed, dismissed as sensor ghosts or equipment malfunctions. It wasn't until the third sweep confirmed the presence of multiple large contacts approaching from deep space that someone thought to wake up the duty officer. And by then, as these things often go, it was almost too late. The alarm that shattered the Academy's morning routine wasn't the familiar chime that announced meal times or class changes. This was the kind of sound that made seasoned officers reach for weapons they hadn't touched in decades, and made cadets wonder if they'd accidentally triggered something they shouldn't have. It was the invasion alert. Lucia's first thought, as she crouched behind a training barrier with simulated plasma fire still crackling overhead, was that someone had decided to add an extra layer of realism to their exercise. Her second thought, as she watched Instructor Blackstone's face drain of all color while he shouted into his communications unit, was that this probably wasn't part of the curriculum. All units, return to base immediately. Blackstone's voice cut through the chaos of the training ground like a vibroblade through tissue paper. This is not a drill! Repeat! This is not a drill! The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The senior cadets who'd been playing enemy forces moments before were suddenly sprinting toward the Academy complex with the kind of urgency usually reserved for reactor breaches or cafeteria food poisoning. The carefully orchestrated training exercise dissolved into barely controlled pandemonium as everyone tried to process what was happening. "What's going on?" Uma demanded, her usual composure cracking around the edges like old paint. Before Lucia could answer, not that she had an answer, the Academy's main communications array lit up like a festival fireworks display. Emergency broadcasts flooded every available channel, creating a cacophony of overlapping voices that somehow managed to be both urgent and completely unintelligible. Unknown contacts. Electromagnetic pulse detected. Communications array compromised. All senior staff report to... The transmission cut out in a burst of static that sounded like the universe clearing its throat before delivering very bad news. Admiral Hawkins appeared on the training ground with the kind of speed that suggested either excellent physical conditioning or the liberal application of panic. His usually immaculate uniform was disheveled, and his expression carried the particular blend of confusion and determination that military officers wore when reality decided to deviate from the manual. "Cadets, listen carefully," he announced, his voice carrying across the training area with parade ground precision. "We have confirmed hostile contacts approaching the system. Multiple large vessels. Origin unknown. Estimated arrival in approximately 3 hours." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Kultex's mandibles clicking nervously and what might have been Holbrook's quiet whimpering. "The good news," Hawkins continued with the forced optimism of someone trying to find a bright side to an asteroid collision, "is that this is probably just a misunderstanding. Pirates, maybe. Or a merchant convoy with malfunctioning transponders." "And the bad news?" Uma asked, though her tone suggested she really didn't want to know. "The bad news is that our initial hailing attempts have been met with what our communications staff describes as aggressively unfriendly responses, and approximately half of our senior command staff is currently attending a strategic planning conference on the other side of the sector," which was military speak for, "We're flying blind with a skeleton crew and the people in charge are conveniently located somewhere that might as well be another galaxy." "What about General Martinez?" Lucia asked. Hawkins's expression somehow managed to become even more grim. Currently unconscious in the medical bay. Apparently, she was in the communications center when the initial electromagnetic pulse hit. Doctor says she'll be fine, but she's going to be out of commission for the immediate future. The implications settled over the group like a blanket made of pure dread. The academy, designed primarily as a training facility, suddenly found itself potentially in the path of hostile forces, with a command structure that could charitably be described as improvisational. "Sir," Holbrook said, stepping forward with the kind of rigid posture that suggested he was trying to remind everyone that he was, in fact, the most physically imposing cadet present. "What are our orders?" Hawkins looked at the assembled cadets with the expression of someone who'd just realized he was about to ask children to do an adult's job. "For now, maintain readiness posture and await further instructions. We're hoping this resolves itself diplomatically." "And if it doesn't?" Lucia asked quietly. The Admiral's pause lasted approximately long enough for a small civilization to rise and fall. "Then we improvise." The next 2 hours passed, with the kind of agonizing slowness usually associated with waiting for medical test results or watching paint dry in low gravity. The academy buzzed with activity as staff and senior cadets prepared for, well, nobody was entirely sure what they were preparing for, but they were preparing for it with remarkable efficiency. Lucia found herself in the unusual position of having nothing to do except think, which was generally a dangerous situation for someone with her particular brand of tactical awareness. She studied the Academy's defensive capabilities, which were designed more for training purposes than actual combat, and tried not to think about how inadequate they would be against a serious military threat. The Academy's location, chosen for its isolation and training value, suddenly seemed less like a strategic advantage, and more like being stranded on a desert island during hurricane season. Help was too far away to arrive in time, and their communications capabilities had been reduced to the electronic equivalent of smoke signals. "You're doing that thing again," Uma observed, settling down beside her in the cadet common area. "What thing?" "That thing where you stare at tactical displays and think thoughts that make the rest of us nervous." Lucia gestured at the holographic representation of the Academy and its surrounding space. "Look at this. Really, look at it. We're a training facility with token defensive systems, minimal military hardware, and a command structure that's currently held together with good intentions and caffeine." "Your point being?" "My point being that if these are actual hostiles with serious military capabilities, we're not just outgunned. We're not even playing the same game." Coltex approached with that unsettling silence that characterized his species' movement. His compound eyes reflected the light from the tactical display in fractal patterns that were simultaneously beautiful and deeply unsettling. "Unless," he said thoughtfully, "that's exactly why we might have an ODV advantage." Both humans turned to stare at him. In Lucia's experience, sentences that started with "unless" in military contexts usually led to either brilliant insights or spectacularly bad decisions. "Explain," she said. "They're expecting to encounter a military installation," Coltex continued, his mandibles clicking in the rhythm that indicated serious thought. "Prepared defenses, coordinated response, standard tactical doctrine. Instead, they're going to find a school full of students and training equipment." "That's not particularly encouraging," Uma pointed out. "Isn't it? In my culture, we have a saying, 'The hunter who expects prey may overlook the predator.'" Before either human could ask for clarification, Commander Webb's voice echoed through the Academy's intercom system with the kind of forced calm that suggested things were about to get significantly worse. Attention all personnel. We have visual confirmation of the approaching fleet. All cadets report to emergency stations. This is not a drill. The visual confirmation, displayed on every screen throughout the academy, was the kind of sight that made optimistic thoughts curl up and die. 12 massive vessels, their designs unlike anything in the Galactic Council's databases, approached in perfect formation. They were sleek, predatory things that looked like they'd been designed by someone with strong opinions about the aesthetic value of violence. "Well," Uma said, with the kind of forced lightness that people used when discussing their own impending doom, "at least we know they're not merchants with transponder problems." The lead vessel was easily twice the size of the Academy's largest training ship, and it was flanked by smaller craft that still dwarfed anything the cadets had trained on. As they watched, the formation began to spread out in what was unmistakably an attack pattern. "Nethrak Empire," Commander Webb announced over the intercom, her voice carrying the weight of very bad news. "Confirmed hostile. They're demanding our immediate surrender. The Nethrak Empire." Even Lucia, whose knowledge of galactic politics was focused primarily on tactical applications, knew that name. They were the kind of aggressive expansionist power that the Galactic Council had spent the last century carefully avoiding through a combination of diplomacy, economic incentives, and the occasional strategic deployment of overwhelming force. Apparently, diplomacy was off the table. "All senior cadets to the command center," Webb continued. "Junior cadets to emergency shelters. We are now under attack protocols." The announcement sparked a flurry of activity as cadets scattered to their assigned positions. Lucia found herself moving toward the emergency shelters with the rest of the junior class. But her mind was elsewhere, processing the tactical implications of their situation. 12 ships. Unknown capabilities, but almost certainly overwhelming by any reasonable standard. The Academy's Cercihans Paridanin Saitanoima Anduri. Defenses consisted primarily of training systems and a handful of actual weapons that were more symbolic than functional. Standard doctrine would call for immediate evacuation or surrender, but evacuation wasn't possible with communications compromised and the nearest friendly forces days away. And surrender? Well, the Nethrak Empire's reputation suggested that surrender might be a temporary solution at best. "Wait," she said suddenly, stopping so abruptly that Uma nearly walked into her. "Wait, what? This doesn't make sense. Why here? Why now?" Uma looked around at the chaos of cadets and staff preparing for what might charitably be called certain doom. "Does it matter?" "It always matters. Tactical situation. Analysis 101. Understand your enemy's objectives before you try to counter them." She pulled up her personal tactical display, studying the Academy's position and the approaching fleet's formation. The Nethrak Empire doesn't make random attacks. They're methodical, strategic. They plan their operations around specific objectives. "Maybe the objective is conquest," Holbrook suggested, appearing beside them with his usual impeccable timing. "Maybe they decided to start their expansion with an isolated target they could overwhelm easily." "But that's just it," Lucia said, her excitement growing as the pieces began to fall into place. "We're not strategically valuable. We're a training academy in the middle of nowhere. We don't control shipping lanes, we don't have significant industrial capacity, and we're not a major population center." "So why attack us?" Uma asked. Lucia's smile was the kind that usually preceded either breakthrough insights or spectacularly dangerous decisions. "Because we're not the target. We're the test." The implications hit them all simultaneously. A training academy, isolated and lightly defended, would be the perfect place to test new weapons, new tactics, or new strategies against Galactic Council forces without triggering a major military response. "We're the warm-up act," Uma said slowly. "Exactly. Which means they're not expecting serious resistance. They're expecting a quick victory against a token defense force." "That's still what they're going to get," Holbrook pointed out with his usual optimism. "We're cadets, not a military unit." Lucia looked around at the chaos surrounding them. Cadets running to emergency positions, staff frantically coordinating what defenses they had, the general atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Then she looked at her tactical display, studying the Academy's layout with fresh eyes. "Maybe," she said quietly, "or maybe that's exactly what we want them to think." The first Nethrak ships began their final approach as the Academy's emergency systems activated. Blast shields slammed shut over windows. Defensive systems powered up with the mechanical whine of equipment that hadn't been used for anything more serious than training exercises and emergency lighting cast. Everything in the kind of red glow that was probably supposed to be calming, but mostly just made everything look like a crime scene. In the command center, Commander Webb stared at tactical displays that showed 12 enemy vessels bearing down on her position with what appeared to be the inevitability of a natural disaster. And in the emergency shelter, a cadet who barely came up to most people's shoulders was beginning to smile in a way that would have made her instructors very nervous if they'd been there to see it. The Academy's fate, it seemed, was about to depend on someone who'd never commanded anything more significant than a training exercise. What could possibly go wrong? The first Nethrak bombardment hit the Academy's outer perimeter with the subtlety of a meteor strike and approximately the same level of property damage. The blast sent tremors through the emergency shelter that rattled teeth and made everyone wonder if their last meal was going to become their actual last meal. "Well," Uma said, as debris rained down outside, "this is going better than I expected." "How is this going better?" Holbrook demanded, his voice carrying the pitch that people usually reserved for discussions of impending doom. "We're still alive," Uma pointed out, with admirable optimism. Lucia, meanwhile, was studying her tactical display with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle while the building collapsed around her. The Nethrak attack pattern was precise, methodical, and completely predictable. They were systematically targeting defensive installations, communication arrays, and power generation facilities. Standard siege doctrine. Textbook perfect. And absolutely wrong for their current situation. "They're playing by the rules," she murmured. "What rules?" Kultex asked, his compound eyes reflecting the emergency lighting in kaleidoscopic patterns. "Military engagement rules. Neutralize defenses. Establish fire superiority. Demand surrender. They're treating us like a military installation instead of what we actually are." Another blast shook the shelter, and somewhere in the distance, something expensive exploded. "What we actually are is a target," Holbrook said. "A very poorly defended target." "No," Lucia said, standing up with the kind of sudden decision that usually preceded either brilliant victories or spectacular disasters. "What we actually are is a school, full of training equipment, simulation systems, and people who know how to use them in ways the Nethrak aren't expecting." She activated her communication unit, broadcasting on the emergency frequency. "Commander Webb, this is Cadet Lucia. I need to speak with you immediately." The response came back crackling with static and the sound of things breaking in the background. "Cadet, return to your shelter. We're handling the situation." "With respect, ma'am, you're not. You're fighting the war. They want you to fight. Instead of the war you can win." A pause that lasted approximately one geological age. Explain. They're expecting standard defensive tactics from a military installation. Instead, give them chaos from a training academy. Use the simulation systems to create false sensor readings. Use the training equipment to make them think we have capabilities we don't. Make them fight ghosts while we hit them where they're not expecting it. Another pause. Then, report to the command center immediately. The command center looked like a disaster had been visited by a slightly smaller disaster, and they'd decided to have a party. Half the displays were dark. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of impending doom, and Commander Webb looked like she'd been personally wrestling with the forces of entropy. "Talk," she said without preamble. Lucia activated the main tactical display, highlighting the Academy's training facilities. Here, the holographic training chambers can project false heat signatures, false energy readings, even simulated weapons fire. To their sensors, it'll look like we have defensive positions where we don't. And while they're shooting at holograms, we use the maintenance tunnels and service corridors to move strike teams into position. Small units, hit and run tactics, use their size against them. Webb stared at the display like she was trying to decide whether this was brilliant or insane. "Cadet, you're talking about using training equipment against a hostile fleet." "Yes, ma'am." "That's—" Webb paused, rubbing her temples. "Actually, not the worst idea I've heard today." Within minutes, the Academy transformed from a military installation under siege to something that resembled organized chaos with delusions of grandeur. Training holograms activated throughout the complex, creating the illusion of defensive positions where none existed. Simulation systems generated false sensor signatures that made the Academy appear to have twice as many defenders as it actually did. And through it all, small teams of cadets moved through maintenance tunnels like particularly determined moles, carrying improvised weapons and the kind of desperate creativity that came from having absolutely nothing to lose. Lucia found herself in the unprecedented position of coordinating the entire operation from a maintenance closet that smelled like cleaning supplies and broken dreams. Her tactical display showed the Nethrak forces responding exactly as predicted, concentrating their fire on targets that existed only in the realm of extremely convincing illusions. "Strike Team 1, you're clear to move on the southern landing bay," she transmitted. "Strike Team 2, hold position until they commit to the holographic gun emplacement." "Strike Team 3. She paused, watching the tactical display with growing amazement. "You're doing great. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." The Nethrak response was swift and decisive, and aimed at completely the wrong targets. They poured devastating firepower into positions that contained nothing but light and clever programming, while the real threats moved unseen through corridors that didn't appear on any military schematic. "You know," Uma's voice came through the communication system from her position with Strike Team 2, "I'm starting to think this might actually work." "Don't jinx it," Lucia warned. But privately, she was beginning to think Uma might be right. The Academy's defenders were fighting the kind of asymmetric warfare that turned conventional military thinking inside out and shook it until its lunch money fell out. And for the first time since this whole crisis began, they were winning. The question was whether they could keep winning long enough to matter. The Nethrak fleet's confusion was almost palpable through the tactical displays. Their perfect formation began to waver as they found themselves shooting at targets that flickered out of existence, pursuing energy signatures that led nowhere, and generally experiencing the kind of tactical frustration usually reserved for people trying to assemble furniture with instructions written in an extinct language. "Strike Team 1 has neutralized the southern landing party," Uma reported, her voice carrying the breathless excitement of someone who'd just discovered that impossible things were, in fact, possible. Turns out, Nethrak warriors aren't expecting to be ambushed by people hiding in air conditioning ducts. Strike Team 3 has disabled 2 of their sensor drones, Coltex added, his harmonic voice somehow managing to convey smug satisfaction. Their targeting systems are now approximately as accurate as a drunken Gorvan trying to thread a needle. From her command position in what had formerly been a janitor's closet, Lucia watched the tactical situation unfold with the growing realization that they weren't just surviving. They were actually winning. The Nethrak forces, designed and trained for conventional military engagements, were being systematically outmaneuvered by what amounted to a particularly creative group project. "Commander Webb," she transmitted to the main command center, "I think we need to escalate." "Escalate how, exactly?" "We're already fighting above our weight class by several orders of magnitude." Lucia studied the tactical display, noting the Nethrak fleet's increasingly erratic behavior. "They're not just confused, they're starting to panic. Military units that can't identify their targets or predict their enemy's behavior tend to make increasingly desperate decisions. Such as calling for reinforcements, or escalating to orbital bombardment, or deciding that the only way to win is to destroy everything that might be a threat." The silence that followed was broken by another explosion, this one significantly closer to the command center. Through the static-filled communication system, they could hear someone shouting about hull breaches and structural integrity warnings. "Point taken," Webb said grimly. "What do you suggest?" "We end this before they decide to solve their tactical problem by removing the Academy from existence." Lucia activated her communication unit, broadcasting on all frequencies. "All strike teams, converge on the primary Nethrak command vessel. Full offensive. Everything we've got." "Everything we've got," Holbrook's voice came back incredulously, "is training weapons and improvised explosives." "Sometimes," Lucia said, coordinating the final assault while simultaneously trying to ignore the fact that she was essentially sending her fellow cadets into a battle that would have made seasoned military officers reconsider their career choices. That's exactly what you need. The final assault was the kind of chaotic, desperate, utterly insane operation that military historians would later struggle to categorize. Strike teams emerged from maintenance tunnels, air ducts, and what appeared to be a laundry chute, attacking the Nethrak command vessel from directions that didn't appear on any tactical manual. Training weapons, it turned out, could be surprisingly effective when used by people who'd spent months learning exactly how they worked and what their limitations were. Simulation grenades, designed to create realistic but harmless explosions, could be modified to produce very real and very harmful electromagnetic pulses. Holographic projectors could create enough visual chaos to blind sensors and confuse targeting systems. And cadets who'd been underestimated their entire lives could fight with the kind of desperate creativity that made conventional military thinking obsolete. The Nethrak command vessel, faced with boarding parties that seemed to materialize from nowhere and attack with weapons that shouldn't have existed, did what any rational military force would do when confronted with the impossible. They surrendered. The aftermath was the kind of confused, exhausted silence that followed natural disasters and final examinations. The Academy's defenders found themselves staring at tactical displays that showed the Nethrak fleet powering down weapons and requesting permission to withdraw. "Well," Commander Webb said, her voice carrying the stunned disbelief of someone who'd just watched physics take a holiday, "that worked better than expected." Lucia emerged from her maintenance closet command post to find herself surrounded by cadets, instructors, and senior officers, all of whom were looking at her with expressions ranging from amazement to profound confusion. "Cadet Lucia," Admiral Hawkins said, appearing with the kind of formal bearing that suggested very important conversations were about to happen. "I believe congratulations are in order." "Thank you, sir, but nothing. You just coordinated a successful defense against overwhelming odds using nothing but training equipment and tactical thinking that I'm not entirely sure is covered in any manual." General Martinez, recently recovered from her electromagnetic pulse-induced unconsciousness, joined the growing crowd around Lucia. "Cadet, I'm recommending you for immediate advancement to the Accelerated Command Program. Your tactical innovation under pressure is exactly what the fleet needs." Lucia looked around at the assembled officers, the damaged academy, the exhausted but triumphant cadets, and the tactical displays still showing the retreating Nethrak fleet. Then she looked down at herself, still barely 5 feet tall, still wearing a uniform that was designed for someone considerably larger, still the smallest person in any given room. "With respect, ma'am," she said finally, "I think I'd rather stay here and help train the next class of cadets. After all, someone needs to teach them that size isn't the most important qualification for command." "And what is?" Martinez asked. Lucia smiled, the expression carrying all the confidence of someone who'd just proven that the impossible was merely improbable. "The ability to see solutions that don't exist yet." As the Academy began the long process of recovery and repair, word of the battle spread throughout the Galactic Council. The story of how a training academy had defeated a Nethrak fleet using nothing but creativity, determination, and a cadet who proved that leadership wasn't measured in inches became the stuff of legend. And when the next class of cadets arrived, they found themselves being trained by instructors who understood that sometimes the most important battles were won not by the biggest or the strongest, but by those who could think beyond the limitations everyone else took for granted. Among the new arrivals was a particularly small human cadet who bore a strong resemblance to a certain famous graduate. He was, if anything, even smaller than his sister had been. But as Lucia had learned, and as she would teach the next generation, size was just a number. Leadership, creativity, and the ability to turn disadvantages into advantages. Those were the qualities that really mattered when the alarms sounded and impossible things needed to become possible. The galaxy, it seemed, was in excellent hands. Very small hands, perhaps, but excellent nonetheless.